New Zealanders being hungry for change.
Kia ora and good evening, and welcome to Not the 6 o'clock news. Well, we're a week out from the general election, and as you know, on Monday, Kim.com will be hosting an event at the Auckland Town Hall, The Moment of Truth. New Zealanders will already have heard these gentlemen speaking on Radio Live, on The Nation, and I think, Bob, you're appearing on Q&A.
We both have.
You both are tomorrow morning. It's a real honour for me to have Bob Amsterdam and Glenn Greenwold here tonight. And I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions about issues that you may not be asked by, the mainstream media. But first, Glenn, as you will have heard, the Prime Minister's responded to your interview on The Nation this morning, saying that he will release documents that show that a plan for so-called mass protection by the GCSB was rejected by him in late 2010, early 2011. He says that that is the material that you have. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, first of all, I find it very odd that he thinks he can anticipate and know what our reporting is going to be prior to it's actually appearing in the world. I think an interesting question is, what is his confidence level based on? Secondly, I think the fact that he, for the first time, has come out and acknowledged that his government planned and prepared a system of mass surveillance on New Zealanders is extraordinarily newsworthy, and I'm glad that's been disclosed for the first time. And if my visit here results in nothing more than that, I will have considered it a success. It's really important that in a democracy, citizens know what their government is doing. And thirdly, the reporting that we're doing is very careful reporting. None of the stories that we publish based on the Snowden archive have been called into question in any meaningful way over the last year and 2 months, and I'm very confident in the reporting that we're doing and that the reporting is completely accurate, and we will stand by it entirely, and New Zealanders can judge for themselves once the story is published and the documents are available.
So still some surprises in store for the Prime Minister on Monday?
I think so. It seems to be things that he is going to be either surprised by in terms of their publication or in terms of what his own government was doing that he can then claim he didn't know about. But either way, I am very confident that our reporting will hold up.
You've presented, the evidence from Snowden through your reporting for many, many months now, and in every country it's led to a reaction from senior political leaders, from prime ministers and premiers, and from media and the general population. What do you make of the Prime Minister's response today to you personally, compared to the response you've had from world leaders who have been confronted with the information that you've shared?
Well, initially I would say that world leaders tend to consider it important to be perceived that their comments have just a standard level of professionalism and dignity to them, which is a concern from which the Prime Minister here seems to have liberated himself from. He doesn't seem to be particularly interested at all in engaging on the issues, but instead launching what seemed to be some pretty desperate ad hominem attacks on the journalists rather than engaging with the journalism, and that's certainly been quite different. But I think that the reaction shows that he is aware that the general public is very engaged with these questions, and that if it's found that he misled the public or did things that the public was unaware of that they dislike, that could be threatening to his political interests. And I just think you're seeing a politician react with a fair amount of concern and fear and desperation, and that has what has produced this sort of unhinged and very unstatesmanlike attack on the work I've done.
What kind of people will be watching and observing the reaction of the New Zealand government and the Prime Minister in particular to your reporting on the New Zealand end of the Snowden leaks?
Well, this has been a very global story from the beginning because there is no nationalized internet. We all share the same internet, and mass surveillance of the kind that we've documented is taking place is something that affects people around the world. So I do think there will be global interest in the story the way there has been in most of the stories that we've been able to produce over the last year. But I think the most significant audience for these questions is the New Zealand populace and the voting electorate. which will have to decide which politicians in this country they want to empower. And hopefully the reporting that we are doing will do nothing more than inform that citizenry so they can make a more informed choice. Just
Bob, I mean, you've observed the reaction over the last several months to the release of Snowden's documents. You've yourself been involved in exposing human rights issues around the world and defending those who are victims of human rights abuses. What would you predict to be the kind of spin that might be put on the revelations on Monday by those who would prefer us not to know so much about the way our government operates?
Well, look, John Key, frankly, has already demonstrated that he's become somewhat, I think Glenn's term is unhinged. It is very poor judgment for a political leader to attack anyone not engaged in the political sphere, because in fact you actually escalate their importance. So already on day one he's made a significant mistake. Number two, by attempting to depreciate the value of Glenn's work by using a term as he did, he demonstrates some real desperation. It's clear he knew Glenn was coming. We don't know how he came to this.
Well, I think it was
early.
one of those things that Kim.com let slip at one of our public meetings.
Very possibly, but it's clear they've been preparing. And I think this is just one of those other incidents where internet mana is opening up the political space for real dialogue. I think that's one of the things that often gets missed about what you all have been doing, which is you're providing and provoking real debate. The politicians in this country seem to want to treat elections like a supermarket where you go in and you know exactly what you're getting, which is generally parties that don't have a very well expressed or defined view and that sell themselves through slogans. I think you are to be credited with really bringing up major issues. Like, for instance, with the surveillance debate, it is your law society here in New Zealand that took an incredibly strong stand and that in fact went to the United Nations on this issue in respect to the spy bill. A lot of the stuff that Glenn and others are bringing up have been raised by your own civil society, but they simply haven't been heard because your fourth estate, the media, has been somewhat captured by big business looking for advertising dollars. And I think there's an argument that perhaps they're not doing their jobs in terms of really putting governments to the test.
Well, and in the one interview that he did, in-depth interview on the GCSB legislation during the course of the debate last year, John Key appeared on the John Campbell show,
Yes,
Campbell Live. And I think that might be one of the programs that you'll be unpicking on Monday night.
Yes, and I think, again, John is one of those journalists who've done a lot of work on this issue. And he's also dealt with, the incredible chronology of the Kim.com case. And he's a serious journalist who's been pursuing it. And I think one of the questions you have to ask, I'm sorry, as a foreigner, it hits me, the willingness of this government in a fairly remote country of the world to be literally drumming up the terrorism idea, to drum up this situation and attempt, if you will, to present threats that in a more objective sense don't really seem justified to outside observers. The populace has to ask themselves why the government's trying to instill fear, why they've been laying terrorism charges in certain situations. And I know they've been rebuked in one of the major cases here. This is a matter of real concern. And frankly, it's typical normally of countries where there's a serious risk of oppression.
You've talked about the chilling effect that surveillance, I think you both have talked about the chilling effect that surveillance has on civil dissent, on critique. we're in an alliance, the Internet Party, with the Mana movement, which has come out of decades-long movements for Indigenous rights. How important are these issues in the framework of those movements for Indigenous rights around the world?
Look, let's be clear. The Indigenous movements are very often targeted. They're the first targets because in many societies they are the other. They are the outside group who have been marginalized through colonialism. And while there's been a tremendous emphasis on attempting redress, very often they, in behaving in a manner that may not be part of the political or educational mainstream, are targeted. And you have to be particularly sensitive not only to those issues, but to the economic deprivation. And when you're an internet party and one of your big issues is freedom of access to knowledge, that makes the relationship between the internet and Mana parties, I think, so unique and yet so important for the world, because it is the Indigenous people who will be most hurt by many of the policies of this government, which are leading to growing income inequality, and also to the fact that this growing criminalization or attempt to expand copyright on the internet so that essentially the internet becomes a toll road is something that will have the most grievous injury on the poorest, and so many of the Indigenous people here are at the lowest economic rungs in the country.
The casual way in which we all, increasingly casual way in which we share details of our private lives on our Facebook pages, teenagers are creating these incredible digital footprints in a consensual way, is often used as a reason why we might be less concerned about the kind of intrusion on our privacy that the Snowden leaks and other information shows us is happening at a state level. Why is it different? Why is this level of intrusion different from the almost voluntary privacy breaches we engage in? Are we waiving our right to privacy online? Are we waiving our right to intrusion into our digital world because we are sharing so much of our personal information voluntarily with our friends and other networks?
There's an enormous, really a fundamental difference between things that you as an individual voluntarily choose to disclose to the public versus information that you've chosen to make private, that is essentially taken from you without your consent. It is true that in the internet age there is a lot of voluntary sharing of information, but this has always been the case. I mean, as human beings, we're political and social creatures. We do need other people to see what it is that we're doing, to acknowledge what we're doing, to be aware of the choices that we've made. That's the social animal aspect of our human nature. But at the same time, at least as fundamental to human nature is this desire to also have spaces where you can go where nobody is able to monitor what you're doing or to cast judgmental eyes upon you. And human beings have always sought out both this public aspect to their existence, but also this deeply private one, and they're equally essential to what it means to be human. And so the fact that there are people making choices to share information publicly doesn't in any way undermine the fact that we also need spaces and the ability to make choices and to explore who we are in private. And when we lose that, when essentially our entire existence becomes a public one and no longer is there space that we can go to in order to think and reason and explore and experiment and dissent without other eyes being cast upon us, we lose an essential component of what it means to be a free individual. And there's all kinds of evidence that shows, and I think human beings just know this, that when you're being watched, you make much more constrained behavioral choices, that the options that are available to you are far less than they are when you know that you can do things without anyone else being aware.
Why might this be a particular concern for young people, for young people who are exploring their relationships in this digital environment? why might they be particularly concerned about surveillance?
It's interesting, when I met with Edward Snowden in Hong Kong, and I was most interested in trying to understand why somebody like him, 29 years old, with a very stable and lucrative career and a very fulfilling personal life and basically his whole life in front of him, would throw all that away in order to make these disclosures available. Essentially what he explained to me was that for him, the internet was not just a discrete tool that he used to receive pictures of family members or go online and shop, that it was essentially the way in which he was able to explore the world and himself. And I think for young people around the world who live in societies that are fortunate enough to have mass access to the internet really has become this place where we live a substantial part of our lives, both internally and externally. And that's why young people have been overwhelmingly supportive of these disclosures and concerned about privacy in the way that people who are older haven't, because they understand the centrality of the internet in terms of how we live our lives, how we explore who we are. And young people in particular, I think it's extremely important to be able to have that sense of personal exploration where you test the limits of dissent, where you experiment with different personas, where you get exposed to ideas or experiment with ideas that you may or may not come to ultimately accept, but that all of this is possible only if you're able to do that without constantly being monitored and judged and surveilled.
So what do you think will come of Monday?
Look, I think what has already come of Monday, thanks to Glenn's earlier arrival, is an opening up of more information. The fact that the Prime Minister has, before Monday, come out and said he was presented with this incredibly dangerous, ridiculously named program should be ringing bells all over the country.
The protection program.
The protection program. It should be ringing alarm bells all over the country. And this is 48 hours before Monday. And it already goes against the tenor of what the Prime Minister already publicly stated. I think there's going to be more of these types of revelations in response to a clearly profound impact in the Prime Minister, where he's feeling that, and this is a very rare moment that Mr. Snowden has allowed us to have, which is we may have information he doesn't have. You see, governments are more and more developing the capacity of never being in that position. Their whole modus operandi now is to have such an overwhelming level of mastery of information that the individual is frankly somewhat paralyzed, so that they can constantly raise these, unfortunately, these falsehoods and not be disproven. And that's why I think Glenn's arrival alone has already had a very salutary effect on opening up the political space.
And of course we've had the evidence in the last few weeks presented by Nikki Hager in the book Dirty Politics, which I'm sure both of you have read or had access to, that shows that the government has been prepared to selectively declassify and release security information in order to, you know, play a political game. So we'll all be watching out for that over the next couple of days. It's certainly happened here before. Well, thank you very much for being on Not the 6 o'clock news tonight.
Thanks for having
us.
Thank you.
And yeah, we're looking forward to the moment of truth on Monday. The Auckland Town Hall, 7 o'clock. The Moment of Truth, where Glenn Greenwold and Bob Amsterdam and some special guests will appear with Kim.com. And we're leading into the final week of the election with some home truths for the Prime Minister. Thank you for joining us on Not the 6 o'clock news. Ka kite anō, and stay informed, Aotearoa.